All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're wading into some pretty deep philosophical waters, exploring a question that's probably crossed your mind
Hmm.
if you've ever, spent any time thinking about the nature of prayer, especially when you're asking for something specific.
Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
talking petitionary prayer,
Hmm.
those times when you're requesting, I don't know, a healing, a change in your circumstances, some kind of divine help.
Right.
We're going to try to unpack all the fascinating philosophical puzzles that pop up when you think about this practice alongside the traditional idea of like a monotheistic God,
Hmm.
all-knowing, perfectly good, unchangeable, unaffected by anything external, free, and all-powerful.
Yeah.
The whole bunch of ideas that when you put them together, well, let's just say they create some real head-scratchers for us to try and untangle.
Definitely. Prayer, as you know, can be all sorts of things. We express gratitude, we offer praise, we seek forgiveness. But when we zero in on that aspect of asking for something specific, that's where we really start to encounter those deep philosophical waters. Our mission today is to kind of navigate those waters with you, looking closely at how the very attributes we ascribe to God can actually complicate the idea that our requests, our prayers, can really make any difference.
Exactly. So the core question we're really circling today is this. Can petitionary prayer truly be effective given these traditional characteristics we assign to God?
Yeah.
And maybe even more fundamentally, what does effective even mean in this context?
Yeah.
We'll be leaning on some pretty compelling philosophical arguments to try to, really grasp these intricate ideas, hopefully in a way that makes sense for everyone.
Absolutely.
So where should we start with this?
Well, I guess a good place to start might be thinking about what it even means for a prayer to be answered, right?
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Answered prayer. What does that even mean?
So, from a philosophical standpoint, it goes a bit deeper than just the thing you asked for happening. It's not enough to just, pray for a promotion and then bam, you get one. That on its own isn't necessarily a philosophically significant answer to your prayer.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about coincidence. Like, if I pray for rain and then it happens to rain, that doesn't automatically mean my prayer caused it, right?
Precisely. Philosophical thinkers take it a step further. They suggest that God brought about that promotion or that rain, at least partly because you prayed for it. That's the key element here. Influence. The idea that your prayer somehow prompted God to act in a way that maybe he wouldn't have otherwise. If the promotion was already in the works, or the rain was just part of, the natural weather pattern, then your prayer wasn't really effective in this specific influential sense. It's about whether the prayer actually made a difference to God's actions.
Right. So the real effectiveness hinges on this idea that we as humans can actually influence an all-powerful being, which immediately brings us to what seems like a pretty big obstacle. The notion that God is unchangeable and unaffected by anything outside of himself. Divine immutability and impassibility. Big words, big concepts.
Yeah, and for philosophers, it's this tension between those two attributes and the practice of petitionary prayer that's particularly interesting. You see, if God is immutable, meaning he can't change, and impassible, meaning he's not affected by anything outside of himself, then how could our prayers, which are definitely external to God, possibly move him to act? It's like we're presenting a request to someone who, by their very nature, can't be swayed.
It almost feels like, I don't know, trying to convince a rock to roll uphill just by asking it nicely.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So if God truly is unchangeable and totally unreactive, it seems to follow that logically, no matter how sincerely we pray, it wouldn't actually change anything on God's end, right?
Yeah.
Making petitionary prayer kind of ineffective in that specific influential way we were just talking about.
Right. And this presents a real challenge for those who believe in the power of petitionary prayer. And so there are a few different philosophical avenues they've explored in response to this problem.
Okay, so what are some of those responses? How do people reconcile this?
Well, one approach is to kind of question the absolute nature of God's immutability and impassibility. Some folks argue that attributes like God's compassion and forgiveness, which are pretty central to many religious traditions, seem to suggest some degree of responsiveness to human actions and suffering. If God genuinely feels compassion, isn't that in a way being affected by something external?
That's a good point. If you believe in a God who loves and cares, the idea that God is completely unmoved by, our joys and sorrows can feel a bit, distant.
Exactly. Another approach is to go for a more nuanced interpretation of immutability and impassibility. Philosophers have tried to redefine these attributes in ways that still maintain those core ideas of God's perfection and independence, but also make room for some form of divine responsiveness to prayer. This gets into some pretty intricate theological territory, exploring the very essence of what it means to be God, and it's probably more than we need to dive into for our purposes today.
Yeah, agreed. We want to keep it focused. So, what's another philosophical strategy for navigating this apparent conflict between God's nature and the effectiveness of prayer?
Well, a third major line of thought is the idea that God works according to a providential plan, and this plan inherently includes both our prayers and the outcomes that result from them.
Okay.
Here, people often cite the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who proposed that we pray not to actually change God's mind or disposition, but to receive those very things that God has already decided to bring about through the act of our praying.
So the prayer isn't changing God's plan, but it's like a predetermined part of that plan. Kind of like a key that unlocks a door God was always going to open anyway.
Yeah, that's a helpful analogy. The prayer itself becomes like a causal link within God's overall design. But, and this is important for our conversation about effectiveness, if God already has the outcome decided and our prayer is just a foreseen step in that process, it kind of makes you wonder, is the prayer truly effective in the way we first defined it? That it influences God to act. It could be argued that in this view, we're more like actors in a play where the ending is already written.
Right, so the focus shifts from our agency influencing God to our participation in a divine plan that's already laid out. Okay, I think I'm following.
Good.
So let's turn our attention to another big concept in traditional theism that seems to create similar puzzles: divine omniscience. The idea that God knows everything, past, present, future, the whole shebang.
Right, and that brings up another really fascinating intellectual challenge. If God already knows every single detail of the future, who's going to pray for what, and what the consequences of those prayers will be, it can feel like the future is already set in stone. So how can our prayers, which we're saying right now, in the present, possibly change a future that God knows with absolute certainty? It's almost like trying to rewrite a book that's already been written and read by someone who knows every single word.
Yeah, or like trying to change the outcome of a game when the score is already known.
Exactly.
The steps leading up to it are already set. So how can prayer bring any real change or newness into a future that's already known?
That's a question philosophers have wrestled with for, well, ages, really. And there isn't just one single, universally agreed upon solution.
Of course not. It's philosophy.
Right. But one perspective, known as open theism, offers a pretty unique answer. Open theists argue that God can't know for certain those parts of the future that are truly open or undetermined. Things like our free choices, or even God's own free responses to our prayers. They propose that there just aren't any definite truths about those future contingent events.
So are they saying that God doesn't have like a complete and detailed blueprint of the future? That's a pretty big departure from the traditional view, right?
It is. While open theists affirm God's vast knowledge, they set a limit. They say God's knowledge is limited to what's actually knowable. They argue that future free actions, well, they're not yet determined and therefore not knowable even by God, at least not definitively. This allows for prayer to be truly effective because the future isn't set in stone. Our prayers and God's responses can actually help shape outcomes that weren't predetermined.
Okay, so that makes sense in a way, but I can see why that might ruffle some feathers.
Definitely. This perspective is pretty controversial, as you can imagine, because it seems to challenge the traditional understanding of God's all-encompassing knowledge.
Right. It requires a rethinking of some pretty deeply ingrained theological ideas. So what about other ways of understanding God's knowledge of the future and how those views intersect with prayer? Are there any other approaches?
Yeah, definitely. Another influential viewpoint is known as middle knowledge.
Middle knowledge.
Middle knowledge. This theory suggests that God has this intricate knowledge of the future because he knows two key things. First, God knows what every possible creature would freely do in any conceivable situation. And second, God knows which of those situations will actually happen. So God knows what you would pray for if you were faced with the specific challenge, and then he uses that knowledge when he creates the world and guides history.
So it's like God anticipates our prayers in a way because he already knows how we would freely respond in various situations.
Exactly. Those who support middle knowledge believe that even though God knows what we will freely choose to do in the future, those choices are still genuinely free.
Okay.
They even use the idea of counterfactual power, the idea that when we make a free choice, we also have the power to do something different, and if we had done that different thing, God would have always known that.
Interesting. So where does prayer fit into all of this?
Prayer, from this perspective, becomes something God can factor in when he's putting the universe together, like a master planner. God knows how we would pray in different scenarios, so it's all part of the grand scheme.
That's a pretty sophisticated way of trying to reconcile divine foreknowledge with human freedom.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are some philosophical challenges to this view, too.
Oh, absolutely. Critics of middle knowledge question whether there really are definite facts about what everyone would do in every possible situation. How could God, or anyone for that matter, know all those hypothetical scenarios and our free responses to them? It gets into some very deep philosophical waters about knowledge itself.
Makes sense. Are there any other approaches?
Yeah, there's another one. Timeless eternity. It's the idea that God exists outside of time altogether.
Whoa. Okay. So how does that framework engage with this whole question of prayer and divine knowledge?
Well, timeless eternity basically says that God doesn't experience time in a linear way like we do, but perceives all of history, past, present, and future all at once. So in this view, God knowing the future isn't about looking ahead. It's about having simultaneous awareness of all events across time.
So from God's perspective, our future prayers and their answers are all happening right now. There's no before or after, like we understand it.
Exactly. And similar to those who support middle knowledge, folks who believe in timeless eternity say that God's complete knowledge doesn't cancel out human freedom. They propose that God's single act of creation, from outside of time, encompasses all events in time, including our prayers and the corresponding divine actions, all viewed eternally, of course.
It's a perspective that definitely stretches our human understanding of time and knowledge.
Yeah.
Are there any philosophical wrinkles with this view, too?
Oh, yeah, for sure. One big challenge is trying to figure out how God's timeless knowledge can inform what we see as God's choices or actions in time. If God knows eternally what people will pray for at a certain point in our future, shouldn't God also eternally know his own response?
Right.
It gets tricky to grasp how there can be genuine interaction or responsiveness in a timeless framework.
So it seems like every attempt to harmonize divine omniscience with the potential effectiveness of prayer runs into its own set of philosophical knots.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And it's worth mentioning another viewpoint here briefly. Theological determinism.
Okay.
This view takes a different route and says that God actually determines everything, including our future prayers and what comes of them. This neatly solves the problem of God's knowledge because he knows the future simply because he's the one who ordained it.
Oh, interesting.
But, of course, this creates big challenges to our understanding of free will and the problem of evil, as we touched on earlier.
Right, because if God decides everything beforehand, including our prayers, do our prayers really have any meaning? And does that mean God is responsible for everything that happens, good or bad?
Yeah, exactly. Those are massive topics in themselves.
Definitely a whole other deep dive.
For sure. But while we're on the topic of omniscience and prayer, there's one last interesting idea to consider. Praying for the past.
Praying for the past. That sounds like a paradox. How could that possibly make any sense?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But philosophers who subscribe to middle knowledge or the view of timeless eternity have actually argued that such prayers could theoretically have a kind of effectiveness. The idea is, if God knows all of history simultaneously and saw a future prayer about a past event, then God could have taken that future prayer into account when he was acting in the past. Of course, open theists who don't believe in exhaustive divine foreknowledge of future events wouldn't agree with this.
Wow, that's a really mind-bending concept to wrap your head around. Okay, I think I need a break from time travel for a minute.
Me too.
Let's shift gears and dive into the puzzle presented by another one of God's attributes, divine moral perfection. We understand God to be not only all-powerful and all-knowing, but also perfectly good. So how does this characteristic play into the effectiveness of petitionary prayer?
Right. That raises a really interesting question. If God is perfectly good and always provides, wouldn't he automatically do what's best for everyone, regardless of whether we pray for those things?
Yeah, that's a good point.
If God's actions are always in line with perfect goodness, it can seem like our prayers are, unnecessary. Why would we need to ask a perfectly good God to do what's already the best course of action?
Like asking a perfectly just judge to deliver a fair verdict. their inherent sense of justice should already guide their actions.
Exactly. But there are a few different philosophical arguments that try to explain why a perfectly good God might still answer petitionary prayers.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are some of those arguments?
One line of reasoning, put forward by Eleanor Stump, is that God might wait for us to ask for certain blessings to avoid, in a sense, spoiling us or overwhelming our ability to appreciate those blessings. You know, if God just gave us everything good without us even asking, we might become ungrateful or fail to recognize the true value of what we've received.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like sometimes the effort and the asking actually make us appreciate what we get even more. It's about us growing and learning, not just getting stuff.
Right. Along similar lines, Michael Murray and Kurt Myers suggest that by making certain things contingent on our prayers, God helps us avoid idolatry, that feeling of being self-sufficient that makes us forget our dependence on God as the source of all good things.
Okay.
They also propose that observing which prayers seem to be answered and which ones aren't can help us better understand God's will and purpose.
So prayer becomes a tool for spiritual development and for figuring out God's will, rather than just a way to get what we want.
Exactly. Now, when we consider prayers that are directed towards other people, Murray and Myers also suggest that God might make certain good things for others dependent on our prayers for them as a way to cultivate interdependence and strengthen the bonds within our communities. You know, by praying for each other, we're acknowledging our interconnectedness and our reliance on one another.
Yeah, that highlights the communal aspect of faith, right?
Yeah.
And the role of intercession in building that sense of shared responsibility and care.
Absolutely. Another perspective, offered by Richard Swinburne and Daniel and Francis Howard Snyder, suggests that requiring petitionary prayer in some cases actually increases our responsibility for our own well-being and the well-being of those around us. You see, knowing that God might act in response to our prayers can motivate us to actively pursue positive outcomes and intercede for those in need.
It's like God is saying, I'm here and I'm willing, but I also want you to actively participate in seeking what's good, both for yourself and for others.
Right.
But didn't the source material mention some criticisms of this view?
It did. Critics question whether this approach might unintentionally portray God as using people as tools to achieve his goals.
Okay.
And there are also questions about whether it truly fosters responsibility or simply creates the illusion of increased responsibility without actually changing the underlying causal dynamics.
Right. That's an important ethical consideration to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And lastly, the source mentioned David Basinger's point that depending on how you interpret God's moral obligations, withholding blessings when there's no prayer might not actually be seen as a moral problem for God.
Okay.
It all boils down to your specific theological framework and how you define a morally obligatory action for a perfectly good God. Those different interpretations can significantly impact how you view the necessity and effectiveness of petitionary prayer.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about answered prayer, divine immutability and impassibility, omniscience, and moral perfection. And now I think it's time to address a more practical question that you, our listener, might be wondering. Can we ever truly know if a prayer has been answered?
Yes, that takes us into the realm of the epistemology of answered prayer. And as you might expect, it's another area filled with lively philosophical debate.
Of course it is.
Right. Skeptical theists argue that for any event that happens after a prayer, we can never really know for sure if God caused it to happen because of the prayer or for totally different reasons that we as humans just can't comprehend.
Okay.
They suggest that God's ways are just so far beyond our own understanding that we can't possibly discern those specific cause and effect relationships between our prayers and the things that happen afterward.
So basically, anytime it seems like our prayer has been answered, it could just be a coincidence or part of God's bigger plan that we just don't have access to.
That's the core of the skeptical theist argument. But others counter this by saying that if we have general reasons to believe that God does sometimes answer prayers, maybe based on our personal experiences, scripture, or just our own beliefs about God, then it's reasonable to think that a specific prayer has been answered when we get what we asked for.
Okay.
Especially when it seems really unlikely or significant. It's about building a case based on your overall framework of beliefs and experiences.
So that's a more optimistic perspective, suggesting that while we might not have absolute proof, we can still have pretty solid grounds for believing that our prayers have been answered.
Right.
The source material also mentions some statistical studies that have tried to figure out whether prayer actually works,
Right.
which seems like a very scientific approach to something that's usually seen as a matter of faith.
Yeah, it is. There have been attempts to use empirical methods to study the effects of prayer, especially intercessory prayer for healing.
Okay.
Some earlier studies did suggest a positive correlation between people praying for patients and those patients getting better. But more recent studies, ones that were designed more carefully, haven't been able to replicate those findings.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Actually, some have even shown no positive effect or even a slightly negative effect in certain groups of people.
So that might seem like pretty strong evidence against the idea that prayer has any real measurable impact, at least in medical situations.
Yeah, it might seem that way at first glance, but there are some important methodological criticisms to consider when we're interpreting those studies. For instance, it's basically impossible to guarantee that a control group in a study receives absolutely no prayer. People pray for their loved ones regardless of whether they're part of a study or not.
Right.
And plus, the traditional understanding of God is that he's a free and sovereign being, not some kind of force that's bound by statistics. So just because prayer doesn't show a statistically significant effect in a large group of people, that doesn't necessarily mean that God never answers individual prayers in ways that we just can't capture with statistics.
So maybe trying to apply the methods of science to something that's ultimately about faith and divine action has its limitations.
Precisely. The nature of God and prayer might just be outside the reach of our current scientific tools and methods.
Okay. Well, we've certainly done a deep dive into some really complex philosophical waters today. We've explored the challenges of reconciling petitionary prayer with God's traditional attributes, immutability, impassibility, omniscience, and perfect goodness. Each one seems to create its own set of puzzles.
And as we've discussed, there are a variety of philosophical attempts to work through those puzzles, from reinterpreting the meaning of those divine attributes to proposing different models of how God knows and acts in the world. Each approach has its own set of complexities and points of contention.
Right. And it seems like whether or not someone believes that petitionary prayer is effective really depends on their fundamental understanding of God and how God interacts with us and the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Given all these intricate philosophical puzzles, what does the act of praying, of asking for something, really mean for the person who's praying? Regardless of whether it moves God in that direct way we might initially imagine, is the value of prayer solely tied to whether we think God responds, or could there be other deeper meanings and impacts for the one who's praying?
It's a question worth reflecting on, even after our deep dive comes to a close.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep thinking deeply.